Thank you everybody for popping in. I see people are still rolling through, so I'll give a few minutes, but welcome everybody to our book talk and research session with Thea Riofrancos. And we'll get started in a little bit, but I'm happy to give a little bit of an overview of the Jane Family Institute if you're less familiar while people straggle in. So the Jane Family Institute is an applied social science research institute based in New York. And we have 3 core research areas and then a publication that focuses on a variety of social science and policy-related topics. Our 3 core research areas are guaranteed income, higher education finance, and digital ethics and governance. And on a regular basis, we host folks like Thea and other researchers to talk about their work in an ongoing series that we call the JFI Research Sessions. In this case, Thea just came out with this fantastic book, Resource Radicals. So it's more structured a bit more like a book talk, and we hope that it'll be really discussion driven. But nonetheless, this is an extraordinary amount of research that Thea put together in this book based on several years of ethnographic work in Ecuador, as well as her expertise as an assistant professor of political science at Providence College, and some of her other climate-related policy work that she's done. She's a co-author also of Planet to Win, which some of you might have come to our previous book talk with Alyssa Battistoni earlier, actually pre-corona in our office, back when we could see people in person. But thank you everybody for being here virtually. And we're really excited to dig into this research. I also want to note that this session is being recorded. So if you'd like to remain off of the recording, go ahead and turn your video off. And feel free to still participate in the discussion and ask questions via the chat, but just indicate that you would like to remain anonymous or not be part of the recording, and we'll respect that. And I guess finally, a couple notes on the format of this thing. Thea has this fantastic set of slides and presentation, but we want to encourage folks to ask questions throughout. And I'll say, just to bring us all together into this room together, we have folks from a variety of different backgrounds, some who will be more familiar with this kind of research and some less. Everyone's questions are welcome. We have folks joining us from international NGOs, from Caritas, from folks who work on mining through nonprofit organizations in the UN. And we have folks with legal and human rights backgrounds, folks in city government, and then of course also research folks who are in academia, whether graduate students in economics or within our own team, those doing direct empirical work on guaranteed income policies in Maricá, Brazil, and elsewhere. So exciting group of people. This is your company in this virtual room today. Feel free to bring everybody, to bring all your experiences forward and your perspectives as we go through this presentation. I know Thea's looking forward to discussing some of those intersections with you all. So with that, I'll hand it over to Thea if you're ready to go. And thank you so much for joining us to talk about resource radicals from Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador. Over to you.
Thank you so much to Hala and to the Jane Family Institute for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation and as was just said, like those intersections between the different projects that we're all involved in. So now into the book. Over the past 2 decades, 2 historic processes transformed Latin America. My book, Resource Radicals, is about their intersection and their combined implications for left-wing projects that seek to transform an economic model based on rapacious extraction. The first of these 2 processes was the commodity boom. From 2000 to 2014, demand for primary commodities like copper, soy, oil, and beef soared, driven in large part by rapid industrialization in China. During that boom, the price of oil increased almost 500%, accompanied by historically high prices for raw materials across the board. In Latin America, high prices for key exports offer the opportunity of massively increased government revenues, at the same time that they dramatically intensified resource dependency. This renewed economic dependency on oil, minerals, natural gas, and soy exports coincided with a dramatic political development, and this is the second process I alluded to above, what's called the, quote, pink tide, during which a spate of left-wing governments came to power, beginning with Hugo Chavez in 1999. And just to give folks a sense, in 2009, at what is sort of the height of the pink tide, over 2/3 of the region's inhabitants lived under a left of center administration. So this is like an unprecedented scope of left-wing governments in power in a single region. The coincidence of these two processes, the commodity boom and the left in power, transformed the political economy of the region. Ballooning export revenues enabled pink tide administrations to govern from the left, making good on campaign promises to reverse austerity policies and significantly reduce poverty and inequality, expanding access to education and healthcare, and embarking on new public works projects. But the price for improving millions of citizens' socioeconomic well-being was further fiscal dependency on natural resources, and in many cases, the territorial expansion of the extractive frontier, subjecting indigenous communities to displacement and fragile ecosystems to contamination. In other words, economic development threatened the well-being of some of these leftist governments' core constituencies. The same social groups who had mobilized against the prior decade's neoliberal policies now faced a new set of social and economic ills. In this context, resource extraction and megadevelopment projects emerge as salient sites of conflict between pink tide administrations and social movements. Resource Radicals, my book, traces these dynamics in Ecuador, where I conducted 15 months of fieldwork. The decade in which leftist President Rafael Correa, who's on the left there, served as president, was marked by protracted dispute over new mining and oil projects. This conflict split the Ecuadorian left in two. On one side, indigenous and environmental movements claimed that resource dependency pollutes the environment, violates collective rights, and undermines democracy. They called this model of development, quote, extractivism or extractivismo in Spanish, and fought for a post-extractive future. This stance, as I'll discuss further later on in my talk, represented a historic shift. Just years earlier, these same social movements had fought for the nationalization of natural resources. They now, after Correa came to power, resisted all forms of resource extraction. On the other side, the Correa administration defended a pro-extraction stance, asserting that oil and mining are vital for equitable economic development. He argued that this development would benefit the majority of Ecuadorians, strengthen the state, and even bolster democracy. Benefits that, in his government's view, far outweighed the socio-environmental costs. And I just want to call our attention to these photographs, which were taken a couple of years apart from one another. On the right, we have anti-mining protesters in the highlands of Ecuador, in a place that became one of my field sites a few years later. And on the left, we have Correa visiting that same region while I was conducting field work, to tout the benefits of the project that the folks on the right are disputing. The dispute over resource extraction in Ecuador was a dispute between competing visions of development that were articulated and consolidated on the fly, echoing historic debates, but also forging new interests and identities and resulting in a novel kind of political conflict. This dispute in Ecuador speaks to a key challenge of our global moment: the urgent need for development models that are both socially just and environmentally sustainable, and for new political strategies to mobilize for this aspiration. As I'll discuss at the end of this talk, this challenge is of course only intensified in our moment of accelerating climate crisis and political uncertainty. Leftist administrations in Latin America in the first decade and a half of this millennium are ideal sites to explore these challenges. Both policymakers and social movements explicitly politicized and deeply radicalized the relationship between development and extraction. In the process, they raised deep questions about the state, democracy, and the ecological foundations of global capitalism. Within this context, I'll show that Ecuador is a particularly revealing site. It is among the most commodity-dependent economies on the continent and saw intense conflict between a leftist government committed to extraction fuel development and an array of movements opposed to extraction in all forms. In this talk, I'll delve into my book's arguments. And in the process, I want to note that I'll be drawing out broader lessons for how we study and also do political activism around extraction, critiquing some of the ways that the politics of extraction are depicted in political science and also in public policy and the mass media. So, to begin with the book. My book is animated by two questions. Why did activists in Ecuador begin to resist what they called the extractive model and do so with particularly militant tactics? And what were the political effects of anti-extractive protests? I want to briefly draw our attention to that photograph on the right. This is one that I took during a long march that I accompanied activists on. And I think it gives us a sense of how life and death, how much of like an existential threat activists viewed the extractive model. So we see hopefully that it's like a skull and crossbones, a symbol of death. But if you look more closely, the helmet says Kinross, a multinational mining company that had at the time had a project in Ecuador that they then pulled out of. And then the two bones are a mining pick and shovel. And then the bottom says fuera mineras, like out mining companies, right? So like mining companies being equated with death and the response being like, you need to leave our territory. So thinking about, how radical this discourse was and then how politically efficacious it ended up being, what I'm going to argue today is that this militant vision of anti-extractivism and of a post-extractive society was the product of a very specific political juncture. So that political juncture, fancy word for sort of like political context, was marked by a few features. One was the rise of a left-wing government. The second was a Constituent Assembly in which Ecuadorians rewrote their constitution, actually including a bunch of radical rights, such as the rights of nature and the collective rights of indigenous communities. And also the administration's promotion of large-scale mining. Those three were key in creating a context in which this dramatic form of anti-extractive resistance emerged. And I want to note right away, and I'll remind folks throughout the talk because it's important, that large-scale mining is a new extractive sector in Ecuador. It is historically an oil-dependent country, so this is like diversifying to new extractive sectors. And so then, to answer my second question, what were the political consequences of this? I'm going to argue that they were quite dramatic, right? They fractured the left between a left-wing government and movements, and they even did more than that, as within the state, bureaucrats and elected officials began to argue with one another. So they set off disputes between state and society and within the state. In what follows, I'm going to walk us through that history. I gave a sort of summary version, but I'm going to take a step back and walk us through that historical narrative and then the effects of anti-extractive resistance. And what I'm going to start with, though, in a moment after I give this sort of overview, is give you a little bit of a sense of the regional and even global context in which this anti-extractive resistance emerged, which in turn informed my motivations for researching and then writing this book. I'll go over a bit of my field work so you get a sense of what kind of empirical data I'm drawing on. Then I'll walk through my argument. That'll be the longest part of the presentation. There's going to be both archival and ethnographic evidence, some photographs. I'll try to situate you in those moments that I was observing as a researcher. And then the shorter part, but in some ways some of the most interesting questions, is like, what does this imply for the present? Like, my book ends in 2017, though the conclusion goes a little beyond that, but my research ended in 2017. But what does this mean for global climate and environmental politics now, right? So I'll come back to those points. Let me start a bit with what motivated me to undertake this study of Ecuador and what it reveals about broader global and regional dynamics. So I want to sort of remind us, and I know that many folks on this call are super experienced in this area of activism and research, but just for those that aren't, across the globe, we know that the extractive frontier, that just means like new projects going to new territories, affecting new ecosystems and populations. So the expanding extractive frontier is going to new places in the world. In Latin America, in particular, as I mentioned earlier, the commodity boom really spurred a dramatic intensification of extraction. And we see that especially in the Andean region and in the Amazonian region, both of which, it's worth noting, and I'll have some maps later, overlap with Ecuador. Ecuador has Andean mountain ranges and high altitude wetland systems, and it also has Amazonian territory as well. And of course, this extractive frontier, we don't have to go to Latin America to see it. In the US, the fracking boom is tied deeply to the expansion of extraction in the present moment. So, you know, in light of this expanding extractive frontier, and again, what I'm about to say applies to the US, but it really applies particularly, I think, to the global South and Latin America, is that we see this shift in the types of conflict around extraction. And the shift goes from, you know, a more historic concern. So when we look back at the late 19th century, at the early to mid 20th centuries, and we looked at conflict over oil and mining, what we tend to see is like labor militancy and demands for like better labor conditions and for forms of worker ownership or state ownership, right? That's the historic form that resource contention often took, and that continues in the present. But what's happened to sort of replace some of that and sort of proliferate on its own is contention that centers less on labor and more on environmental and cultural concerns. And we also see in particular the growth of indigenous protest against extraction that doesn't often make the same claims as labor militancy might, right? Is making claims around territorial integrity and around cultural integrity and around environmental protection, right? So this is a global trend, but it's very salient in the global South and in Latin America in particular. And Ecuador in particular is going to be very emblematic of this global shift. And as I noted, it's going to respond to a new extractive sector, which I think gives us a sense of the ways in which new forms of extraction, I mean new in the sense that they're new to a given territory or population, can be particularly contentious in ways that more historic forms of extraction may not be. So the eruption of militant protest against the expansion of the extractive frontier also highlights dramatic changes in the political economy of the region. And I alluded to these in the first couple of minutes of my talk today. And that is, as I said, the global commodity boom really intensifying the dependence of governments and broader economies on the extraction, harvesting, and export of raw materials. And in this context, I just want to note that Ecuador is like one of the top cases of resource dependency in the region. It's up there with Venezuela as like extremely dependent and really stands out. This is from 2010 because it's sort of like in the sort of height of some of the moments that I'm looking at, but the trends continue through, I would say, 2014 when we have that crash in oil prices, right? So we can see that compared to Latin America and even South America, Ecuador's export basket is like overwhelmingly primary resources. A lot of that's oil. And as I'll discuss, it's more and more also mining, and as also it's shrimp and cut flowers, right? So Ecuador has a variety of primary material exports, but they're all like not very processed or industrialized, and they're exported to global markets. And I want to note that in particular, the Correa government, and he was in power from 2007 to 2017, a long tenure, reelected multiple times, benefited more from oil price increases than any other administration since Ecuador democratized in 1979. So he had like the most oil money to work with of any democratically elected government. Oil revenues under his term financed over a third of the state budget. But you know, what's important to note and key to these conflicts I'm going to discuss is that even before that 2014 oil crash, and we're in the midst of another crash in oil prices now, but there was one in 2014 as well. Despite how much revenue was coming in, social spending outpaced revenues. So Ecuador was spending more on social programs, which is in many ways a good thing, than it was getting in revenues, right? But that was creating some issues. And so where they went to fill that gap was, on the one hand, loans, especially from China and Chinese development banks, and on the other hand, mining. And so what Correa saw in mining was the possibility of a new extractive sector to fund his expansive social programs. And that is why he really in earnest like inaugurated this moment, this era of mining in Ecuador, and pursued it as a means of new state income. And at this point, and due to Correa's efforts, there are 2 contracts and 2 mines in operation, large-scale mines in Ecuador, in the Amazonian region. So his vision, it didn't fully work. He wanted 5 projects, but 2 of them have moved forward. So I want to return to thinking about Ecuador in regional perspective. So the first thing is Ecuador is highly resource dependent, like the rest of the region, but like a kind of extreme case. The second way in which Ecuador is emblematic, but on the extreme side, is the level of conflict between Correa and social movements. As folks following the dramatic events over the past few years in Venezuela, in Bolivia, elsewhere in the continent where the left has still been in power, there have been tensions of various sorts between movements and governments. And I don't want to get into that too much. I would say that in Ecuador, you had the most dramatic of that, because movements that supported Correa's rise to power, that told their members, vote for Correa, very quickly sort of pivoted and in a very pretty coherent and cohesive way turned against his administration. And we'll see why that happened. It has a lot to do with his resource extraction policy. And so the movements that really turned against him were in large part led by the indigenous movement. And I want to just note that this comes out of decades of indigenous mobilization. In fact, in the 90s and through the early 2000s, scholars of Latin America called the National Indigenous Federation in Ecuador, the CONAI, they'll come up a little bit later, the most powerful social movement in the hemisphere, the entire hemisphere, Canada to Argentina to the Caribbean, like the largest, because they were able to topple so many governments in Ecuador, democratically elected governments that they were able to force to resign. So that's the trajectory that the militant indigenous and environmental politics comes out of, right? In addition to the indigenous movement, we have this interesting alliance that begins to take hold under Correa, this anti-extractive alliance, we can call it, of anti-mining groups. They're not always indigenous, sometimes they are, sometimes they're mestizo, mixed ethnicity, or Afro-Ecuadorian, right, it depends. Anti-oil groups, similar, community water associations. Then we also have, the growth of like radical environmental movements. Sometimes they're based in urban areas. Sometimes they're based in rural areas, right? I don't want to simplify. It's not just like middle-class urban environmentalists. There are environmentalists everywhere, and some of them are low income, some of them are urban, rural, etc. So, but what you have is like this anti-extractive coalition that takes hold, and the environmental discourse really radicalizes. And I'm going to show you again, like a little more about how that happens. I'm going to first just really briefly, I know this isn't like, I'm not in a political science academic setting per se, so I don't need to get into like all the granular stuff about data, because it's honestly, I think it's more interesting to get into the narrative, but I just want to note the kind of field work this is based on. It was a multi-sited ethnography. I'll show you the 3 main field sites in a second. I did it over 6 years, though I had actually lived in Ecuador with my partner, who I think is listening to this call, earlier in 2008. So I actually got, almost a decade of, that should say 2017, sorry, that's, anyways, almost a decade really of experience in Ecuador. And I did, over 100 interviews. I witnessed lots of events, including a 2-week-long march from the Amazon to the capital that covered 700 kilometers in order to protest extractive policies that I accompanied the whole time. And then I did some textual and content and sort of media analysis as well. And just briefly to get a sense for folks that aren't familiar with like the geography of Ecuador, which I assume most are not necessarily, except I know we have some Ecuadorian comrades on the call, but aside from them, folks may not be familiar. Ecuador is a small country. It's like roughly the size of Colorado, but it's like extremely climatically and ecosystem diverse. So it has coast and Amazon and semi-tropical and cloud forests and all sorts, just an amazing place. But where I focused was Quito, which is the capital. It's in the northern highlands, and that's where a lot of the policy making takes place, the corporate headquarters, but also protests. Even folks coming in from the Amazon and rural areas would often protest in Quito. Then we have SY, which is in the southern highlands, the site of a planned mining project that actually still has not happened because of the degree of protest. So note that one of the first slides I showed you with photos had folks protesting that. And then we have 3 years later here in and the protests have continued, and they've been very successful. Then all the way in the southern Amazon, kind of at the foothills of the Andes, where it goes down into the Amazon, and just extraordinarily beautiful area, a UN biome, like really beautiful, is where one of those mining projects I mentioned is an open pit copper mine is in operation, right? So very concerning in terms of the ecosystem effects, but that was my third field site, was that area. So I chose places where the conflict was live, basically. That was my case selection method, to put it in research terms. So now we get into the historical narrative, and you know, I'm stylizing a little bit. Folks should read the book, you know, for lots of details. But I'm going to give you a sense of like how resource politics changed from one form of radicalism to another, right? That's what my book is about. Like, how do resource politics take the radical forms that they do in specific circumstances? So, to understand the historic roots and the novelty of anti-extractivism, which I want to impress on you all, because I think to many folks in this audience, anti-extractive movements are not so novel either, because we're involved in them, we study them, you know, whatever it is. But I want to note that in the context I'm looking at, starting around, like 5-10 years ago, this was a new development. And so I just want to stress that novelty. To understand how it's novel, though, we just go back to the prior period in history that my book traces. And where I'm going to begin is with Ecuador's first indigenous uprisings at a national scale in 1990. This was a moment of neoliberal reform, a moment where there was a lot of social discontent with public policies, and with a feeling of lack of representation, especially among indigenous and Afro-Ecuadorians. They burst out into the public stage in a way that had not been seen before in Ecuador's history, having a levantamiento, an uprising in 1990, and then there were a series of uprisings throughout the 90s, during which they toppled governments. They forced a Constituent Assembly in 94. That's before the one I mentioned earlier, right? So they were real protagonists in politics. In their struggle against neoliberalism, these groups focused a lot on natural resources, just as they do now. But what their claims were a little different. They claimed that oil, in that case, because we're in the pre-mining time, right? This is when Ecuador is just like a petro state. That oil is the collective property of the people. This is their language. They claim to defend sovereignty and life itself against the private and so often foreign appropriation of national wealth. And this emerges in the CONAI, the National Indigenous Federation's 1994 political program. It also emerges in their 1998, oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke before. The Constituent Assembly was in 98. Anyway, when they proposed different articles and clauses to the Constituent Assembly, it appears there. And so in 94, when they were in the midst of another uprising, in their political program, they defined non-renewable and subsoil resources, again, primarily oil, but it could apply to minerals as well, as the, quote, property of the plurinational state that they wanted to establish. They wanted a plurinational state, and they wanted it to collectively own resources. 4 years later, in 98, they said again, oil and mining must be national property. So during these years of intense protests against cuts to public spending, privatization, austerity, all of those neoliberal reforms, this Indigenous Federation, which was a key protagonist in a broad popular sector front, demanded the nationalization of natural resources for the benefit of the people under a rubric of democratic ownership, right? Not just state ownership, but democratically owned. I call this radical resource nationalism, and I do that because this word resource nationalism is used a lot in the media and in scholarship, and I want to just flag that these are like radical grassroots actors. They're not like state actors just wanting to own resource. They have a more radical vision of resource nationalism. And I also want to note for folks that aren't familiar that again, this resource nationalist, I kind of said this a little earlier, but it has a long history in Latin America. So throughout the long arc of the 20th century, labor movements and left parties from Chile to Bolivia to Mexico have seen the problem with extraction through the lens of anti-imperialism and the solution as national ownership of some form, right? So this is like a very resonant set of demands across the region. But as I've flagged a couple of times now, a decade later, just a decade later after that 1998 moment I was just ending with, indigenous movements and their allies came to take a very different stance on extraction. They no longer said the people should own it, right? They're gonna oppose it to court. So Correa entered the 2006 presidential race, riding the coattails of like over a decade of mass mobilizations. capitalizing on his already established anti-neoliberal credentials. This is Rafael Correa, again, the president of Ecuador during the time period we're talking about. He had previously served as a finance minister and he had a reputation as a leftist. He gets elected. After he is elected, those same movements re-articulated their position as a total opposition to resource extraction. And in the meantime, you know, irony in a sense, Correa kind of adopts or co-opts their prior resource nationalist framing. That's like one of the many twists here. And I want to give you a sense of the texture of this discourse, like, and the tactics, right? So what are movements doing? I'm going to take you first to a human rights activist that I spoke to early in my fieldwork, in my first month of fieldwork in July 2010. She told me sitting in her office that extractivism was to blame for basically all problems in Ecuador. So she had a very expansive view of extractivism as a cause of many problems. She recounted to me how the licenses for oil and mineral companies and the construction of highways to get the oil and minerals to market resulted in what she called a new colonization of the countryside. So linking that to conquest, to colonization, and to programs of the Ecuadorian government in the 60s and 70s to colonize the Amazon with mestizos, right? So she's invoking a long history. However, she also had a positive spin on this, which I thought was very interesting, that it's not just pushing people out, displacing them, it's also politicizing them, right? And so she saw the possibility of new forms of collective action. And she noted particularly that campesinos that are mestizos, so small farmers that are of mixed ethnic heritage, are starting to ally with indigenous folks, and that was something new and that she saw a lot of potential strength there. The next week, I spoke to someone who's not an activist, but was actually a legislative advisor to Correa's party. And what I'm going to do here is show you that this discourse and these tactics began to actually spread into the state, that state actors, some of them, not all, and not the majority, but some important ones, began to adopt this critique of extraction themselves, seeing the social conflict, right? And so a week later, I spoke to the legislative advisor of Alianza País, who was later, by the way, appointed to Minister of Economic Policy, so a pretty important person in the regime. And he spoke to me, and these are his words, of two grand projects in contradiction. And what he said the contradiction was the super exploitation of nature and extractivism, those are his words, on the one side, contrasted with buen vivir, the indigenous concept of living well, also sumac causai in Quechua, now enshrined in the 2008 Constitution, the really progressive one. And that is what he called a model that's a civilizational model, like an idea of a new type of civilization, envisioning a total reordering of the relationship between individual, community, and nature. So this high-level bureaucrat is telling me that there are two projects here. One is extractivism and the other is buen vivir, and that the state is caught between them, right? Because the state itself has to follow the Constitution, which has, you know, legal support for both of those, right? Both of those approaches. And so then, you know, I'm going to revisit my question. I know this can feel repetitive, but I think with like each new, like we're getting a little more context and then the questions make a little more sense. So like, again, why did we get this, all of a sudden, this dramatic and quite militant critique of extraction from folks that hadn't had that critique, you know, a couple years earlier? And how did it spread in the state and recast politics so much? And so to remind you of my argument, but now I'll go a little more in detail, there was this critical juncture of a leftist president of the rewriting of the Constitution that gave activists new tools, because now there were new collective rights, there was rights of nature, but it also gave the state new tools, because now it really made clear that minerals and oil are the collective property of the state, right? So in a way, the Constitution empowers both sides. And it creates this political opening for anti-extractivism and for conflict over extraction. I want to just focus for a moment on the Constituent Assembly and why it's so important, in addition to the document it produced, which I mentioned a couple of times, which is that the Constituent Assembly came about because movements demanded it. Correa responded to those demands. There was a referendum. Ecuadorians vote overwhelmingly to convene the Constitution, and then they vote overwhelmingly to ratify it when it's done. But during the Constituent Assembly debates, there already started to circulate among even members of Correa's party concerns about extractivism, right? And this framing, this language of extractivism, which I traced that it starts to get salient in this moment, drew upon radical environmentalist proposals that dated to the 90s, that Ecuador should be a post-oil economy. They drew on indigenous discourses and forms of ancestral knowledge. And they regional discourse that was beginning to critique the left in power for reproducing extractivism, right? And I just want to pause and note, what does extractivism mean? We should never assume that everyone knows. And I think the most synthetic definition is that it's an export-led model of accumulation based on the extraction and harvesting of natural resources, right? So that's what activists, even in Correa's own party, and then movements as well around them, began to target as the main problem. Not neoliberalism, not even capitalism, but extractivism, a sort of civilizational model of a rapacious relationship to nature. These are the sort of contextual conditions, but I argue, as I've already said, that one more thing was really important, which was a new extractive sector, right? Because we needed some kind of trigger to really make these movements salient, and that took the form of the promotion of large-scale mining. This was, as I said, a centerpiece in Correa's economic agenda. It would provide him with new revenues on top of oil in order to fund expansive social programs. But at the same time, we know that mining causes lots of social and environmental harm, right? And so these were sort of dual the two kind of principles in tension here. And sort of as a result of being at the beginning of this crossroads, we might say, do we do mining or not? The stakes became very high. Both promoters of mining in the government and in the corporate sector, of course, and detractors, the anti-extractive activists, but also the critics in their own government, saw mining as a path to be taken or avoided at all costs. It was just like, we're at a fundamental critical juncture here. And if you support mining, you think it's like the road to like a more developed future. If you oppose it, you think that it's going to reproduce extractivism in the worst form. For both sides, an entire model of development was at stake, right? And so I just want to emphasize that this felt very high stakes, and many of my informants use this kind of language of how high stakes it was. I want to kind of give you a little bit of a feel for how the conflict over mining developed. In 2009, there was a mining law presented by the government that was then voted on by the assembly and put into power. That was the first in a series of pro-mining reforms. This mining law, in some senses, expanded state regulation of mining, but it did so in a way that was very auspicious for the expansion of mining, right? So it's sort of like a post-neoliberal but pro-mining mining law, if we want to be like wonky about how to define it legally. The protests that mining law occasioned, which were organized by a nascent coalition of national and regional indigenous federations, radical environmentalists, and local anti-mining groups, those folks all of which I mentioned earlier, were the first inkling of a dramatic political realignment. The fact that movements would come out, organized translocally, meaning in many different parts of the country, against a left-wing government that some of them still supported, but they had certainly supported, when he was elected a couple of years ago, was like, something's about to change here, right? And that's, by the way, the moment in which I sort of decided, as this is my dissertation project, that then became the book, right? During these protests, a press release circulated by the Highland Indigenous Organization, which had a very key role in organizing against neoliberal reforms in the 90s and now anti-extractive movements in the 2000s, highlights how anti-extractivism became a framing for the entire indigenous movement and environmental movement. So I'm just going to read what it says here. This is Humberto Cholango. He was then the president of the Highland Indigenous Federation, and later he became the president of the entire National Indigenous Federation, so a very important indigenous leader in Ecuador. He wrote, "Overcoming the neoliberal model cannot be achieved with the policies of a developmentalist and extractivist model that promotes the extraction of economic resources at whatever cost and reproduces a socioeconomic structure of inequality, injustice, discrimination, and the exploitation of human beings and nature." So that's the tenor of the discourse, and you can imagine also the protest tactics that go along with that, and I'll show you more of them. So, I just want to note that, again, in the context of an avowedly not just post-neoliberal, but 21st century socialist government, movements like pivoted and adopted a new discourse that wasn't just about neoliberalism and wasn't just about instantiating socialism, but was getting at this problem with extractivism, which they saw infecting the left and the right. So throughout my fieldwork, what I saw is that this discourse and associated set of militant tactics circulated very broadly. So for example, at an event organized by anti-mining activists in the province of Azuay, one of my field work sites that I mentioned in the southern highlands, Alberto Acosta, who's a key figure, some of you may be familiar with him, he served as Minister of Energy and Mines under Correa. Then he served as president of the Constituent Assembly Correa administration due to disagreements over this issue, over extraction and over indigenous rights. At this event, he called extractivism the, quote, essence of development, understood as a 500-year history of the imposition of Western modernity. So it's a very long time scale, the critique, and a very kind of profound and radical critique of the prevailing economic model. He thinks it's impossible to make any positive change in Ecuador without overcoming the extractive model of development, and that view is very representative. Later on in my field work, I saw a member of the radical environmental group based in Quito, but with very close ties to indigenous groups in Ecuador. The group is called Acción Ecológica. She presented almost the same account as him, right? Not because she copied him, but just because this discourse became so shared, the narrative so, widely circulating. And this was at an event over debate over mining in the highland province of Imbabura. And she swept across a long history of extractivismo. She dated it to 1534, the year of the Spanish conquest of Quito. And the moment, quote, of insertion into the world market. So you also, if you're familiar, see the kind of world systems and kind of dependency theory ideas that are prevalent in these discourses. But I just want to note, because this is also important, that even within this 500-year history that they tend to recount, Correa's the worst, in part because he pretends to be a leftist and he's as bad as the rest, right? But really it's because the discourse congealed under his administration and he's the main target of it. So I think there's also that kind of conjunctural reason for their focus on him. So as conflict over extraction intensified, anti-extractivism became the primary language of contention, guiding strategy and tactics of movements. It circulated in a symbiotic relationship with the administration's unrelenting push for extractive projects. You have the administration pushing extraction, movements respond, right? And it just goes higher and higher and escalates. Every node in the extractive model, from the perspective of activists, constitutes a potential target for mobilization. So protests while I was in Ecuador was as likely to erupt in the streets of Quito, at some ministry or at a courthouse, as it would in the immediate sites of mineral and oil extraction, even in landscapes that hadn't yet seen the projects yet, right? And so there's a real geographic array to where protest takes place.
And Thea, we have a question coming up in the chat, and I thought I would let Madhu.
Tell me.
Yeah, I would let Madhu actually just voice it herself, and then you can decide if you'd like to answer it now or if it'll come up a little later. Madhu, I think you can unmute.
Yeah, sure. I can ask it right now. Sorry, to go back to my notes. Yeah, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but I had two questions. And I also, do want to say that thank you for your wonderful talk. And I did enjoy your chapter the most in A Planet to Win, because I was very concerned about the relative silence of proponents of Green New Deal regarding the exploitative relations of global supply chains for renewable industries. My first question was basically just throughout your talk, and when you were talking about the conflict between indigenous sort of social movements in Korea, I was wondering, and you also spoke about how it came across also due to a decline of employment. I was wondering, is it then fair to say that, despite the election of quote unquote leftists to power, the root of conflict between the anti-extravists and Korea's government resulted from the rise of surplus populations that were made redundant by capital, and the resulting sort of reactionary endeavors of economic nationalism, which is kind of fundamentally antithetical to any genuine endeavor of climate action. My second question was more to do with just what you thought, because throughout this talk, I was sort of going back to Andrea's mom's sort of his formal versus real subsumption, and how he applied that to, renewable and extractive industries, and how he basically sort of made the claim that, nature is formally subsumed in the case of energy sources like water and wind and solar power, but these sources can be appropriated but not exactly owned because, they don't have a precise location, they're diffused throughout the atmosphere, they resist contract, and they're fundamentally unpredictable, which kind of make it inferior to like sources like coal, despite, these sources being free because of their uncommodifiability. Energy from coal, etc., therefore then can be subsumed under capitalist logic, because over here, energy can be produced whenever, wherever, and disciplined in a way which is not possible with renewable sources. Just wanted to know what you made of that. And sorry for interrupting, and thank you for a wonderful talk.
No problem. Let me just clarify something. I don't catch the name of the question asker, but will they be on for the whole talk? Or
yeah, I'm here for the whole time, and I'm Madhu.
Yeah, I think I should finish the talk first. I don't know that it will answer either question, but I think both will get, there'll be a little more material that addresses actually both of those, because the second one relates to some of my current research that I'm going to talk about at the end. To the extent that I don't answer both of them, I can revisit them as the first question after the talk. I don't know.
That's perfect.
What we think is best. I think I should do that, and I'll come back. But I'll just say really briefly about the second point that I think that the fact that renewable energy is not just about the immediate capture of like wind or sun or whatever, but also about a whole built environment and a set of supply chains, like really complicates the idea that like they're less amenable to capitalism. I mean, I'm in favor of renewable energy transition 100%, but we can very much see and are already seeing how the production of renewable energy is like, can very much fall within the grooves of green capitalism. Right. So yeah. I'll come back to that. And I wouldn't be shocked if he's maybe even changed his thoughts about some of that in much more recently, but those are both great questions. The one about surplus population is a little harder to answer succinctly, but I'll keep it in the back of my mind while I go through the rest.
Sure, thank you so much.
No problem, they're great questions. Okay, so I'm gonna proceed, and actually I had this other little review, but I'm not gonna do it, sorry. I'm also like a teacher, professor by training, and so I'm used to repeating myself a lot in case things aren't clear. So I'm gonna just skip over. I think that we get the argument, which I presented a couple of times now. I just wanna pivot to the government, because I've spent a lot of time with movements so far, and they're among the most important protagonists here, but they're not the only protagonists. And unlike some ethnographic work on extraction and anti-extractive movements, I focus, a pretty big bulk of my research on the state and corporations as well, right? So I want to kind of bring them in and see what they're doing. And what I want to argue is to show how much, or sorry, a better way to put it is how powerful anti-extractive movements were as protagonists, reshaping the terrain of conflict. And part of the way that we can see that is how their opponents reacted, right? Whenever we're looking at a political terrain, to understand like who's the protagonist on that terrain, we see how one actor responds to the other. And the way that the Correa administration responded to extraction is very interesting, right? And so, first let's start with Correa, and then I'll complexify things a little bit. Correa adopts a very, very strident defense of extraction. He doesn't budge. Correa, he's a really, in many ways, an amazing politician that I have sort of respect for on the level of like, he's a great orator. He, pulled together a difficult coalition, but he is a polarizer, right? And so he responded to movements by doubling down on his position rather than negotiating. And that in turn escalated movements. And that's that dynamic, that escalatory dynamic that I referred to. So he argues, not only is it good for development, it's good for democracy because the majority of Ecuadorians voted me into power and therefore this is delivering on my democratic mandate. He had very elaborate, and every week the Sabatina, the weekly Saturday broadcast, televised and radio, hours long in the Latin American leftist tradition, like hours long oratory, he would expound and elaborate and cite, leftist theory written by Latin American, it was very elaborate. I'm simplifying it a little bit now, but basically he said extraction is good for democracy and development. he also in effect like redeploys this resource nationalism that movements had basically abandoned. And he does it in a watered down form. He does not expropriate foreign capital, despite what, you know, the conservative media might say. And he takes away its more anti-capitalist elements, but he says, you know, resources are for the people, we should use them. He puts this into practice, right? There are new contract models that give more to the state. And that increase the taxes and royalties. And as a result of this and the high prices, we have a dramatic reduction in poverty from 37 to 23% during his time in office, right? And that is nothing to ignore. And I think we have to keep that in mind when we think about the tensions between different leftist goals. You know, I also want to just go, I'm sorry, I'm kind of skipping over this slide a little bit, but I think it gives us a sense. He's holding up a gold ingot. That's his, during one of his weekly addresses. These are the types of language he would use, like, we can't be beggars on a sack of gold, we can escape poverty, etc. But, you know, he wasn't the only person in the state, right? And so then there was this conflict within the state, which I found fascinating. And I actually found it so interesting that I came up with a name for the bureaucrats that didn't like extraction, and I call them critical bureaucrats. And I see them as, they couldn't be an explicit coalition with the protesters, they would lose their job, but they did contribute to like the circulation of anti-extractive discourse, because even at sometimes government events, someone in the government would talk about extractivism as a problem, right? And so these critical bureaucrats, they were especially located in the planning ministries, which was actually very important ministries under a left-wing government, you can imagine, economic planning, and also some other ministries that were tasked with like cultural preservation and cultural patrimony. What they claimed in interviews with me is that a post-extractive economy, the same language as activists, this imagined future in which Ecuador is no longer economically dependent on primary commodities, was a solution to underdevelopment and to ongoing socio-environmental conflict. So they too use the sort of world systems dependency theory idea that we escape underdevelopment by escaping the extractive model altogether. But what gets a little thorny is like these bureaucrats worked for a state that was expanding extraction in the moment, right? So how did they deal with that contradiction? Some of them just left. A few of them left, very high profile ones, Alberto Costa, Monica Chuhi, etc. But the ones that stayed came up with an elaborate justification, and it went like this. They would justify the expansion of extraction, mining, and new oil in the present in terms of the revenues it would generate to transform the economy in the future. Large-scale mining, a sector still in the early stages at that point of its construction, was to be the beginning of an end, a quote, post-oil vision, as one bureaucrat told me, or as another official put it, quote, the last moment of extraction. Right? How long is that moment? It continues today, obviously. At the same time, their colleagues that were more directly involved in attracting mining investment and negotiating those contracts, so people in the Ministry of Non-Renewable Resources, them and Correa became more and more intense against anti-extractive activism. And in fact, his government pursued legal action against nearly 200 indigenous and environmental activists, right? So indigenous and environmental activism against extraction was criminalized. And then it got very dramatic at the end of his last term in office in 2017. The Correa government deployed military and police against indigenous Shuar communities who were protesting their displacement by a Chinese-owned mining project, right? So we had militarized conflict and a multi-month state of emergency. And, you know, then other folks in the government were divided on this question. And so we're coming near the end. What I'd like to do here is sort of zoom out, because I know there are a lot of folks on this call that like study extraction as journalists, as activists, as, you know, as scholars. And I want to sort of highlight a little bit of how my approach is different than that prevails in not only scholarship, but honestly in like mainstream media conversations, which is this idea of a resource curse, right? That idea is that if you are a resource-dependent state, and it's often like Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or these states that are referenced as examples, you are automatically authoritarian, and you are, or at best, you're like a low-quality, limited democracy, but mostly you're an autocracy, and you're also perennially economically underdeveloped. Now, there's a million critiques of this idea, even though, honestly, it continues to be the dominant one in political science. You know, there's some obvious things like, what about countries that aren't underdeveloped and that have a lot of resource extract? You know, it's like, you know, there's some holes in the theory. But what I want to get at is like their view of resource politics that I find extremely limiting. And this idea that like oil and minerals just produces authoritarianism, right? And in contrast, what I want to argue is that there's no direct causal relation between resources and politics, that it's context dependent, right? I'm also going to, as I've shown, it's not just about elite actors, right? So I'll come back to that in a second. So I do want to note that there was a tension between economic development as you know, understood in, you know, a relatively maybe mainstream sense, and resource dependency in Ecuador. But it's one that is a little more complex than this theory lets on, right? So, you know, when we have the left in power in Ecuador, for example, or in Bolivia, Venezuela, Brazil, Uruguay, lots of countries, resource extraction was like a double-edged sword. So in the short term, they did enable, as I've said, like massive outlays of public expenditures that did lift up the material circumstances of many key constituencies of their governments, and the poor and lower middle class key among those, right? And they also therefore buoyed their political chances, in the sense that like left-wing governments that could spend all this money like were understandably popular because the money was having real effects. But the problem is that in the longer term, they locked in an extractive model of development. And that itself undermined or made more challenging a broader social and economic transformation. It also drove a wedge in some cases like Ecuador between governments and movements. So that's a way more complex argument than like oil causes underdevelopment, right? Because in some senses, oil helped development in the sense of reducing poverty. In other cases, in other ways, it undermined it, right? And so I think, you know, complexifying that resource curse idea, that's one way to do so. But another way, you know, in the idea of the resource curse, and in the mainstream media coverage of these resource dependent states, the idea is that like civil society is just like repressed or co-opted, and they're just like along for the ride. Like they get some benefits maybe, or if not, the military goes after them and that's it, right? What I want to show in my book is that indigenous, labor, campesino, and radical environmental activists were not just passive recipients of oil spending or just victims of repression, right? They are agents, they are protagonists, and they opened up entire new arenas of conflicts, new languages of contention, and new stakes to older conflicts, right? And as a result, not only activists, but even some bureaucrats rejected an extractive model of development altogether, an outcome that's basically inexplicable within the resource curse framework, which, you know, assumes that all actors are like bound to continuing the extractive model. And they also were extremely creative and tactically intelligent, right? The movements, right? So they did all sorts of things. They elected anti-extractive leaders to local and provincial government. They marched from the Amazon to the capital multiple times. They organized nature walks through the still verdant sites slated for extractive ruin. They occupied mining camps that they had been displaced from through territorial displacement. They did popular forms of environmental monitoring of the impacts on water, air, and habitats. They took legal contention, but they also tried to enact rights themselves in various ways that I go through in the book, right? So an incredible diversity of tactics working against and within political institutions that really complexifies the idea that extraction's bad for democracy in some straightforward sense, right? Because in fact, these movements are actually revitalizing democracy from my perspective. Against extraction, right? So that's the sort of extra layer to it. And then to sort of close out here, you know, I just want to kind of underscore how deep a conflict over extraction is on the peripheries of the world system, right? So like the national territory and the natural resources it contains are literally the foundation of the state. And they have been the foundation also of all sorts of aspirations for moving up in the world system, right, historically. In resisting the extraction of resources, indigenous and environmental movements called into question this taken for granted relationship between state, nation, territory, and resources. And so to conclude, I just want to note that though my narrative ends in 2017 in the book, more or less, though it points a little to the future, I think that, you know, the basic relevance to the present is that we see an intensification of these forms of conflict with climate change and with intensifying inequality and intensifying political uncertainty. Right now, as I said in response to that earlier question, I'm focusing on the extractive frontiers of green technology supply chains, specifically lithium batteries and electric vehicles, and focusing on the environmental and social impact of lithium extraction in Chile. And in Chile, activists are calling out what they call green extractivism. So it's been fascinating for me to see, and I've sort of, from my data and my interviews in Chile, I spent 4 months there last year, activists tell me that the idea of extractivism is newer in Chile, right? And so it's interesting to see how these concepts and tactics travel across borders, but also across sectors, and are now targeting the extractive sectors necessary for a renewable energy transition. So that just shows the malleability of these identities and these social movement frameworks. Once they're consolidated, they can move and target new issues. In this case, lithium extraction. And I'm happy to talk about that more in Q&A. And I just want to close out, and this is my final point here, which is that, in this talk, I've emphasized a lot intra-left conflict. I've also emphasized movements calling out a left-wing government for the ways in which they reproduced an extractive mode of development. Despite that acrimony, and despite the fact that there was real fracture in the left in Ecuador, I want to emphasize, and this is sort of how I end my book, the necessity of both the left in power and the left in resistance. I don't think that we can get where we need to go, right? We, problematic sometimes use that collective pronoun, but, for folks committed to climate justice and social justice, I think we need both. We need both left resistance in the streets and militancy and direct action. We also need to get left-wing leaders, hopefully from our ranks, into power, right? It can't be one or the other. For the foreseeable future, achieving socioeconomic equality on a livable planet constitutes the key political task, not only for the hemisphere, but for the world. For all the limitations and contradictions of the pink tide, without the left in power, political, social, and economic inequalities mutually reinforce one another, denying a dignified life to the vast majority of the population and protecting the privileges of the few against the democratic will of the many. And for all the challenges of sustaining anti-extractive movements, resistance against oil, coal, gas, and mining projects is absolutely vital to avert climate chaos and localized environmental destruction and pollution. So despite the potential for conflict between these two left projects of left in power in government, left in the streets, they're fundamentally intertwined. Global warming deepens inequality within and between countries, undermining a core goal of leftist governments. And wresting political power from fossil capital, democratizing state institutions, is a prerequisite to do anything about climate change. So what is the possibility then of Latin American leftists reconstructing a viable political project that can weave together egalitarian and ecological demands rather than them being potentially in tension? The future is, it's almost like a cliche, extremely uncertain right now. But I'm very inspired by some emergent paradigms, such as the Pacto Ecosocial, the Eco-Social Pact in England, that came out of Argentina, but has spread around the continent. The framework of Nuestra América Verde that has come out of other places in Latin America. We can talk about these more, but they're sort of eco-socialist paradigms, right? And that are really interesting and that encompass both social movement demands and public policy proposals, right? So they get at that government resistance kind of nexus. In this context, it only remains to be seen what popular practices will be enacted, how collective identities will continue to be transformed, and whether, again, the left can forge a path to hemispheric power. And I'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Thea. I wish you could hear the silent applause across everybody right now. I'm sure everybody's clapping in their living rooms. So we have a few questions to start. I also have several discussion items to sort of flesh out some of the pieces from the book as well. But I'll start with the question back in the chat. Nathan, do you want to unmute yourself and voice your question? Or Madhu, do you want to reiterate something that might have emerged based on the conversation?
No, I think I'm good with those two questions. I'll leave it to Nathan.
Okay.
Sure. Just one sec, sorry. Okay, so my question is just sort of an expansion of Madhu's, or adding on to that, I guess. Basically, I'm just asking about the state of extractive employment in Ecuador. I read a book from Martin Arboleda on Chile and the extractive industry there, and he talks about how direct employment in the extractive industry has declined in favor of like service industries surrounding extraction, as well as like temporary contract employment within the industry. And I just kind of see this, and I think this might be in Arbeleida's book, but I kind of see this as like an example of the more broad divergence of as like the sort of labor left from the broader proletariat, the interests of those diverging over time because of this growth in surplus populations, the more or less permanently unemployed in terms of formal wage labor populations. And I was just wondering, so yeah, the state of employment in extractive employment in Ecuador, and if you think that may account for part of this split on the left that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I love Martin's book, and he's a close friend, and I have an essay on it coming out in a little bit, so we could follow up with this conversation with more on that piece. But yeah, I basically I guess I'll just say yes to like the basic intuition of your question, which is that extractive industries increasingly over time do not generate stable or direct employment in large numbers. They are increasingly capital intensive, technologically intensive, and actually automated, computerized, algorithmed, all the stuff that he goes over in his book. That's actually even increased and accelerated since I was working on my field work in Ecuador. But absolutely, like the promises of local economic development through employment are like increasingly hollow, and communities are rightfully suspect of them, which is why communities, regardless of whether they are anti-extractive or not, meaning whether they outright oppose extraction, they often try to secure other forms of economic benefits that do not hinge on employment, because employment is just not generated in any stable or dignified way. So I think that's right. I also think that it's right that what we have instead of stable and dignified employment is not no employment. It's not like mining is fully automated, whatever that would mean, or like post-work, but rather, and I'm just recapitulating Martin's argument a little bit for folks that haven't read the book, but rather it creates precarious forms of employment in the service sectors that serve miners, anything from like a restaurant to, like selling clothing to any kind of like service related work or retail work. But it also extends in his analysis to like engineers and coders and people in sort of white collar jobs that are also themselves increasingly precarious, right? As the stuff gets more automated. And so everyone's like an appendage to the mining machine in his account. In Ecuador, I wasn't able to witness those dynamics firsthand. And sometimes, even though I sort of said it, it could have maybe borne repeating, that I was studying these conflicts over mining before mining arrived in Ecuador. Like there was no mining. I mean, there was artisanal mining, and I don't want to, I'm being a little simplistic. There was artisanal mining, there was small scale mining. None of these extractive, mega extractive open pit projects had commenced yet. I was looking at a period in which the contracts were being signed. Now, one of them is in full operation and the other is in late stage construction, right? So when I was there, there was no mining employment to speak of. But what's interesting is that the way the government dealt with both the fact that mining employment is never going to really like stably support these communities or families, but also the fact that like mining was this future possibility that they were promising there would be economic developments of, but like when were communities going to see that, is that they innovated a novel a novel paradigm in mining contracts called anticipated royalties, and they actually charge the companies royalties before sales, and they channel those royalties, like, I forget the exact percentage, I think it's 40%, but I could be wrong, to directly affected communities. Now, I'm not saying that that was a boon for local development either, and we could get into the complexities of like whether or not just channeling economic resources to affected communities is like a good mode of development. I'm skeptical, but like, you know, point is they were obviously aware that like it wasn't going to be enough to promise jobs or even, you know, broad development in the future. They needed to like span that up in the present in order to paint a picture of mining that was more convincing to local communities. And so everything that you're saying is not only true, but it's also like factored into the political calculus in interesting ways.
It's a really fascinating piece of this. Thank you so much, Nathan, for the question. So I saw Melanie's hand and then Paul after that. Melanie, feel free to unmute to voice your question.
Sure. So I want to say I really admire your work. I feel like this book addressed interesting tensions relating to questions of ownership, the state, and accumulation in anti-neoliberal politics. And I feel like that's like a rising set of concerns in other contexts as well. And I wanted to know how those sorts of questions inform your work relating to the Green New Deal. I feel like questions of democratic ownership are obviously quite vital, but I feel like the next terrain is, or set of questions is, the logic of accumulation. I just wanted to know how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that every day, and I'm so glad you brought it up. And I almost want to not talk too long because I feel like there might be some other interesting thoughts from the audience around this. But you know, I mean, a real simple but or broad and simple way to put it at the outset is that it's extremely important to me and to movements I'm involved in, and it sounds like to you and to many folks in this room, to ensure with all of our activism and scholarship and public engagement as much as possible that the renewable green economy does not reproduce the rapacious model of accumulation and extraction and dispossession that continue to mark fossil capitalism and continue to actually mark the transition, right, from fossil capitalism to potentially a greener capitalism. And so that concern that you're asking about like animates my current project around the extractive frontiers of green technology, and also my like eco-socialist activism in DSA and elsewhere. And I don't have a simple answer for how to make sure, or not so make sure we don't replicate the same, but like how to transcend, right? Like how to do something different with this opening we have to, and as the other question asker, the first one whose name I'm so sorry I'm forgetting, you know, different energy regimes like from coal to oil and from oil to renewable are really cataclysmic moments to potentially reshape the global economy. What we have seen historically is that they continue to sediment a sort of neo-colonial world order and also rapacious relationship to nature, but we do another one of those openings and we are living in a world historic moment, right? And so I think it's really important to think of like, how's this opening potentially auspicious for a deeper kind of change? And, you know, one way that I think about this that makes it more concrete and hopeful for me, because I think that this question, your question, very well put, and the question that animates my research, which is basically the same as yours, is like, this almost feels like an insurmountable tension or trade-off, like, oh no, we're gonna like transition to renewable energy, we're gonna decarbonize, and maybe we'll even do so in ways that are super equitable and democratic, like in the global north, but then we're gonna leave all these new zones of sacrifice in like copper mining communities and lithium and cobalt and nickel, and like that, like, is it just a zero-sum game between decarbonization spearheaded by global north governments and zones of sacrifice around the world, right? And so that feels very real and fraught to me. I think the way that I make it feel like that's not the only option, that future, which is like just a different eco-apartheid, even if it's maybe lower carbon emissions, is that we have a moment to really make bold, concrete demands, including in policy form, but also in like social movement demand form, around what kind of green economy we want, right? We are under no obligation to accept the idea, for example, that electric vehicles, individually owned, privately owned, made by these multinational firms with long extractive and unjust supply chains are like the best way to electrify transit. Like there's no reason to accept that, but it almost feels like we have to, like not in this room, but it's really hard, you know, even among big green sort of environmental organizations like Beltway organizations, a lot of whom do work that I respect, there's often an implicit assumptions that like EVs and like EV charging stations in low-income communities or something are like the way to like electrify transit. And to make it more equitable, we just make sure that low-income folks have electric vehicles somehow. Whereas, there's an opportunity to say, wait a second, what if we like really just focus on mass transit, on collective forms of consumption, on electrifying school buses and post office vehicles, and electrifying the regular buses and trains and like minivans in rural communities. Like, what if we had like a collective vision for what a just mass transit electrified system would look like that doesn't involve so much car ownership, because it's that level of car ownership that results in such rapacious forms of extraction. A single Tesla has like 180 pounds of copper in it. So like, yes, maybe a bus has 300 pounds, it's bigger, but like 1,000 people use that bus in an hour, maybe in New York City, right? So it's like about how can we use these resources in ways that first and foremost, protect indigenous rights to consent and ecosystemic integrity at the beginning of the supply chain. But then once those resources are extracted, to the extent that communities consent to that and we're able to trade them in a just and equitable way, like, can we use the resources more collectively and democratically so that we use less of them? We actually use fewer resources when we share, when we consume together. And that's just one way. It's not the only way, but it's like one point of departure to think through the model of green housing, of green transit, of regenerative agriculture that we actually fight for has real implications for its resource and material intensity. And so we should really be clear about like what we're fighting for. It's not just decarbonization in general. It's like a certain vision of it.
Great. Thanks so much. We have a couple questions appearing in the chat. I'm going to have Paul, who's our researcher working on the Marika Basic Income Project, speak up now. I know there was, your book talks about the cash transfer program in Ecuador that was slashed in 2015, but prior to that played a big role in poverty alleviation, but really interesting to discuss the intersection with your work, Paul. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks so much, Hala. And also thank you, Thea, for a really spectacular presentation. I enjoyed it tremendously and found it to be an amazing resource. I actually wanted to sort of ask, in addition to what Hala has put on the table and about which I would love to hear your thoughts, just if you've encountered any particularly compelling evidence of sort of the role of international finance in Petro-Nationalism in Ecuador. What's the relationship there as far as you've seen it?
Yeah, it's funny because I thought you were going to go a slightly different way, so I might say a little bit more about contemporary Latin American movement demands, which I'm sure you're aware of, but just for other folks around the international finance system. But I'll come to the first part of your question, your actual question first, which is international finance played less of a role during the Correa administration. What played a big role was Chinese credit. And I don't want to play in at all. I just want to flag this immediately to some kind of like xenophobic idea that like China is like this new hegemon and taking over the world. That discourse unfortunately resonates among Latin American leftists sometimes, right? So I just want to be clear, but I'm just being objective about like where the money was coming from, right? And so what we had in the Correa government and in the Chavez government and under Lula, what we had in a variety of left governments in Latin America, for different reasons, those governments had like distanced themselves from international financial institutions. In some cases, it was outright default that then kind of cut them off for a little bit of time anyway. Creditors don't want to lend to someone that just defaulted on like, a huge amount of money. So I think the defaults were all well executed. Like, I think they were good that they defaulted, but the consequence was you get cut out temporarily, not only from IFIs, but also from like sort of Western forms of private credit, right? And so, because they're sort of using those same, what the IFIs do as their kind of signal. So what you had instead was a turn to regional development banks. So you had the Brazilian Development Bank, you're, more knowledgeable than me, I'm sure. And then you had, development banks from other regions of the world, like primarily the Chinese Development Bank and the Chinese Import-Export Bank, right? And so those, through a variety of actually, in some cases, kind of innovative financing mechanisms that tied financing not to neoliberal conditions, not to austerity, not to the stuff the IMF does, but tied it instead to like the use of Chinese products or labor in development projects, to the export of the finished, of the raw material that was extracted or harvested to China, that even did sort of oil for debt swaps where debt was paid in future oil. And there's a lot of interesting, I really recommend the work of Kevin Gallagher on this, because those, you know, a lot of people have criticized those, especially in the sort of, you know, Western media often, like, it's sort of like, oh, China's just trying to like, but, you know, and local activists also accuse China, and many cases rightfully so, of like land grabs and, you know, so, but it can get a little complex in terms of evaluating were the loan conditions good or not. I'm sort of torn about it. I think that in some ways they were better than the IMF because they didn't come with onerous like neoliberal conditions, and because the oil for debt swaps were actually based on current prices. Like it didn't freeze a price. It was like whatever the spot price was. So I don't know, but the interest rates could be high. And what's worse though, and Martín Arbeletta's book is great here, is how it locked countries into just like a new extractive relationship, right? So that's the picture under Correa and about the IFIs. We have, since Correa, Moreno, the current government, who was Correa's vice president, but then sort of betrayed the left in a variety of ways, he's negotiated with the IMF. So that was part of the major protests that were last October against some of those IMF austerity measures. So like the IMF is like back in Ecuador, and like protest against it is like reignited, right? So that's another thing happening. The last thing I'll mention, which is where I erroneously thought your question might be going, is that I think there's a lot of interesting discussion in Latin America now, and I'm sure you've encountered this in Brazil, really firm on the need for debt cancellation, like just among activists and among left-wing scholars and policymakers, like how clear it's becoming that debt is just completely unsustainable in its level to private debt and debt to multilateral institutions. And it requires conditions that are bad for the environment, bad for public health with the pandemic, you know, cutting health budgets and things like that, which was part of why Ecuador ended up being one of the epicenters. So it's just clear, and it's clear that like governments in the global South, I mean, of course, I think they also deserve climate reparations and redistribution, but like even putting that aside, if they're servicing debt, they can't deal with climate resiliency and mitigation, right? And so it's, I think in the global North, we need to reiterate that demand as much as possible and make it and introduce it to people that aren't familiar with it in all the spaces that we interact. Because it's like, for me, to go back to the prior question, like part of a Green New Deal globally is like cancel debt, right? And so I think that we can try to make those finance fossil capital connections, but also like finance climate, you know, change connections as well.
No, thank you. That's a really fantastic answer.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'm going to read a question from the chat. Are there examples of countries that have moved from extractive-based left economic programs to redistributive or even activist industrial policy for development or growth?
I wish there were more, but there's not zero. You know, I do want to just remind, like sort of harken back a little bit to something I said earlier in the talk. There were attempts, and they were not fully successful, but they were unevenly implemented in Ecuador and in other countries during the pink tide moment to start diverting extractive revenues into non-extractive sectors. And those were by no means adequate at all. In fact, extractivism was just reproduced or re-entrenched, but I don't want to like simplify that history too much. And I talk about this a little bit in the book. So there are a couple of things that happened. One is that in Ecuador, there were investments made to the so-called knowledge economy and like bio knowledge, and also like ecotourism economies. Now there's all sorts of environmentalist and indigenous critiques of those as other forms of extraction, right? Of extraction of knowledge and of extraction of ancestral practices and also ecosystem services, right? But without getting too much in the weeds of those kinds of critiques, I want to say that there were government officials and government plans and some real money put behind like creating a research economy in Ecuador. Ecuador is just an incredibly climatically, as I said, and geologically and ecosystemically diverse place. And so having like forms of scientific research there like makes sense, right? And so there was attempts at that. The other thing I want to mention is that under Correa, and this doesn't get picked up on enough sometimes by analysts of the administration, that he really did make taxation, the tax base, broader and more progressive. So like the key thing with extractive, the extractive model accumulation, one way you get hooked into it as a government is like you don't have other financial resources, right? That last question by Paul points to that. Like oftentimes these governments had to choose between debt financing and resource rent financing or some combination. What if governments had stable, sustainable, and progressive tax systems that not only taxed income, but also wealth? One of the major issues in Latin America, in addition to debt sucking up the state coffers, is the fact that the rich are severely undertaxed. Like if we think it's bad in the US, which it is, it's like really bad in Latin America. Compared to the OECD average, they are like way low in terms of taxation and therefore low in terms of social spending as a percentage of GDP. And Ecuador made real strides in this under Correa, and some of this is in the book, in taxing wealth more, and he got real protests from wealthy people, literal protests, like elites would go onto the street in their white outfits and like protest him or whatever. So, you know, it became a class conflict of a different sort than the other class conflicts I've sort of talked about, right? And so he made some strides, but it wasn't enough, because when the oil crash happened, the taxation wasn't the streams of revenue from taxation weren't enough to sort of replace oil. There's one other thing. Oh yeah, let me bring one other good example quickly, and it's in the book too. Sorry to keep, but you know, it's a book talk, so I guess I can keep referring to the book. Look at the conclusion to the question asker, because I go over an interesting history that I draw on other scholars for, because I don't myself study El Salvador, but I read some of the fascinating research on it done by a colleague of mine, Rose Spalding, and that does amazing work on Latin America and in Central America in particular, where it shows the process by which El Salvador adopted a ban on metallic mining. And then you can look at Costa Rica, which has had similar national level legislation around both decarbonization, renewable energy, and pretty stringent limits on extraction. So it's not impossible, but it is challenging, even from the left, to get out of the final chapter of my book. The conclusion is like the dilemmas of escaping extractivism for both governments and for like a movement perspective. Like, how do we actually get out of this? And the dilemmas are manifold, and I would just point us back to sort of the position in the world system, because that really is a big impediment on peripheral states in terms of their ability to like change what their basic sectors are. But love that that person said industrial policy. It's like one of my interests right now, and I could go on, but I'm going to stop myself so we get maybe another question before we close up, or we say bye. I don't know when the end of this is.
Thank you so much, Thea. So we are at 2 minutes till planned end of this session. What I'll say is, for those who have to hop up at 4:30, welcome to Thea. Are you okay with staying a little bit after for some more questions? Otherwise, we can wrap it up.
I can do another. I can do like another. Do you want to go till 4:40 or something? I could do another question or two.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Okay. And then for those who have to hop off, I just want to mention that JFI produces a weekly newsletter which highlights really compelling research across the social sciences. Sometimes it's a new book, or it's an old work that gives new perspective on ongoing issues. So if you'd like to sign up for that newsletter, I'm putting the link in the chat, and look forward to engaging with some of you for more conversations via that channel. And then I'll just, maybe Thea, if you stop presenting, then you can see the chat, and I would go quickly to Nafisa's question.
Okay, great. Should I go to the chat or to the Q&A?
The chat.
Okay, cool. And sorry, I'm just, okay, wait. Nathan Nafis, got it, okay. Wanted to ask, I'm gonna read it out loud because that'll help me think about it as I'm going. I wanted to ask, were there tensions with indigenous tribes regarding mining and extraction similar to Canadian First Tribes, some of whom are pro-pipeline and some of whom are against it? In the case of land rights and reclamation, how does that play out in Ecuador? Oh, thanks, I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. Okay, so let me answer such a great question, because like with everything I'm saying, no matter how much I try to somewhat complexify things, I inevitably gloss over complexities. And one of them is the way that extraction divides indigenous communities and also non-indigenous mestizo communities near extraction. And I'm going to even circle back to one of those earlier questions about jobs, right? One of the reasons that extractive sectors are divisive is because sometimes you might have, they don't create a lot of work and they don't create good work, but they do create some work. And so like you might have a family member or a partner or, you know, a relative or whatever, or a friend, you know, whatever it is, working directly in the mine or oil fields or in one of its sort of subsidiary industries very tied to it, right? That person as a worker, of course, might hate the company, might hate the environmental effects, may suffer from them, but may also, as the same way we're talking about, you know, fossil fuel workers and a just transition in the US now, like might feel like bound or invested to some extent in the industry's continuity, right? So that jobs as a source of division and jobs and also economic benefits, you know, building that soccer field by the community or the schoolhouse or whatever it is, companies use those intentionally to divide communities. Not only do they use those economic means of division, they also oftentimes create like fake nonprofits and foundations, or they're not fake, they're real nonprofits, but they're fake because they don't really come from the indigenous communities, the company creates them, right? So companies, I don't even need to, I'm sure this room is very knowledgeable about like all of the deceptive tactics of corporate social responsibility, but they're real and they're divisive. And I see them, you know, my comrades and colleagues in Chile have recounted to me a lot about that in terms of lithium and copper mining. So it's nothing exclusive to Ecuador or to First Nations in Canada, right, as the question asker asked. And so division is real, and it partly is about the forms of fragmentation that the economic precarity generate, and also the intentional forms of political manipulation and corruption that these companies engage in. And so you absolutely, and I didn't focus on them as much, and this is just an artifact of like sort of case selection, which is I didn't focus on like the pro-extraction communities because I wanted to go where there was really live conflict between communities and the state. But there are other researchers, and I can suggest, you know, maybe in a follow-up thing, like who to read on sort of, especially communities that have long-term experiences with extraction. What I would argue, let me actually restart the sentence, because I think this will answer the question even more directly. Remember what I was saying before about how like new extractive sectors are more contentious. And what I think we see is where an extractive sector is historic, meaning it's long-term, maybe like since the 70s in a given community, there's been oil extraction. That it's not that there's no conflict, there is, but there's more familiarity. There's sometimes more acceptance. Sometimes there's forms of like cultural or political hegemony that just like naturalize extraction. And like, it's hard for community members to think of like a non-extractive economy or to trust environmentalists or, you know, indigenous leaders when they say we can do something different, right? So some of those same things that we might see happening, you know, in like Appalachia in the US with like some of the difficulties around, you know, rightful and valid difficulties like convincing folks in mining communities or, you know, in gas or oil communities or whatever it is that like there's a better future with a just transition, that can be challenging in the Latin American context as well. So absolutely there are community divisions, and absolutely the activists that I profile in my book are not, it's not that they're not representative, but it's just that they're one of many potential stances. What's interesting about Ecuador is actually the fact that given all that complexity, that division among communities, the fact that the promise of economic development and jobs is very tantalizing in a lower income and marginalized setting, like despite all that, anti-extractive activism escalated so much, took the hold of so many people's imaginations, and like forced a confrontation with the state. That's what, it's almost like you're exactly right, Nafis, that there are real divisions, but just the fact that despite that, this anti-extractive movement like became so powerful in certain ways, at least even stalling certain projects, like one that I mentioned, is like a testament to you know, to their organizing capacity and to how much their discourse resonated.
Thanks again for that. So I've seen Chloe and Noelle voice a couple ideas in the chat. So Chloe, I wanted to invite you to share some of your thinking on this from your work.
Oh, I think that's, sorry, let me pull this screen down so I can see you guys better. Yeah, I just had a few comments and didn't really have I do have a question actually, but I did point out on Thea's point about the lithium mining is the other issue, I think, is the large scale renewable energy projects too, is like another form of extractivism that will impact communities. And then on the point with the Chinese operations is that they're also like more limiting some of the job opportunities that you might have on a local level, because they often will bring in their own workforce too. So it makes it a little more challenging. As an actual question for you, I might ask about economic alternatives then for communities, because micro enterprises, that kind of level can only help so many people. So how do you create the kind of sustainable economic opportunities that will really generate the kind of economic benefits that a whole country would need? I think it's just a huge challenge how you would sustain enough of a local economy effort to really benefit local people, but then have the kind of economic production that you really need to benefit a whole country.
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I because it's such a great question, I can't totally be satisfying in my answer, right? That's the mark of a good question, I think, in a sense, right? It's very challenging, and if we figure this out already, we on the left or whatever, in solidarity work and folks in Latin America, like, we wouldn't be having this conversation in the first place. So I think like history shows it's challenging. I want to kind of reiterate some of your points a little bit that you made in the course of your question, and then I'll come back to the question at the end. I agree with you, and I say this with a little hesitation because this sometimes puts me in debates with people I'm very close friends with and comrades with in Ecuador and Chile and elsewhere, which is that I don't see as a total solution the focus at times on very local and micro forms of like sustainable eco-development-y stuff. And there's a big, like anti-extractive folks often do focus on like, local organic agriculture or community or ecotourism. And absolutely they can provide livelihoods for some people. And in fact, both of those things that I just mentioned are like, in some ways compared to mining, like relatively labor intensive, like more human bodies are used than in like super automated mining, right? So I don't want to dismiss them. And I also think in terms of land use, those can be much more environmentally friendly in terms of like environmental remediation. And we're putting aside the fact that people might fly to engage in ecotourism. However, I will note actually that in Ecuador and many other Latin American countries, like domestic tourism is pretty large and people might be driving or taking a bus and that could be electrified and whatever. So I think that those aren't negligible, but they're not enough. And I think that the reason that they're not enough is kind of what you are in a way pointing to, something that I actually didn't mention this talk, though it's very important in the book, is like the uneven territoriality of extraction. And what I mean by that is that like extraction most dramatically affects like particular peoples and communities and ecosystems, and it's like contamination. But part of the trade-off and the tension for a left government is that many other people, many more people in cities could potentially benefit from like the economic redistribution of extraction, right? And so that's how, Correa was able to shore up his political support in major cities with low income folks in urban and peri-urban areas, because they saw some of the welfare benefits, those cash transfers that Hala mentioned earlier, right? Whereas the devastation was in places that were marginalized by their rurality and by their peripheral kind of status, both politically and like literally geographically. So there is a little bit, there's a tension there. So like, how do we, to put that in more positive terms, like how do we meet the needs of like the low income urban masses who are the masses in Latin America, and many of them labor in the informal economy, the majority in some contexts, but I think it's something like 40% regionally do, with how do we like address their needs, which are, for housing and education and better work opportunities and X, Y, and Z, and not do so at the cost of environmental devastation and peripheries. That's like so that question of national development when you have a territorially uneven model of accumulation is like where you get some of that tension. What to do. I mean, I'm going to just reiterate a little bit that I think some of what to do is not within those countries. It's like removing like the shackles of debt. I mean, I don't want to, like, I know that's extreme language, but debt kills people. And so like removing that is extremely important. And then coming up with more equitable financing, modes of financing and redistribution in regards to climate related projects, free and accessible distribution of low carbon and green technologies, you know, so those sorts of things. And, you know, with the renewable energy thing, because now it's come up a couple of times, and I think you brought up right earlier in your comment about the land use piece of renewables, which is, don't want to neglect, that's real. But we can definitely imagine, and I love Shalonda Baker's work on this, and we have actually a few essays in the current current issue of NACLA that's on the Green New Deal in the Americas and eco-socialism in the Americas. I co-edited that with someone else. My colleague Daniel Adana Cohen. Anyway, we explore some of these issues of like, what would energy democracy look like in Latin America? Like, what would it look like to have community-owned, cooperatively owned, or at the very least, like major dividends in terms of equity stakes and things like that, for community projects. And Latin America has like enormous untapped renewable potential, but what we don't want is like mega projects. Sometimes the projects might need to be on the large side. I mean, we can get into grid stuff on another conversation. I don't know if we can always do microgrids. I know some activists prefer that, but regardless of the size, like we don't want them imposed by foreign capital or by the state without, not just without community participation, but without real ownership. And so there's a lot that I think can be done there for communities to demand like a stake in the renewable transition that can also provide forms of livelihood or at least revenues for other projects, and at a basic level, like secure access to low carbon electricity, which is something that many Latin Americans lack and is itself an impediment to development.
Thank you so much, Thea. There are so many topics that I think folks still wanted to get to.
I felt that way while I was responding to that last question. I'm like, oh no, this is too
It's just truly several years, almost a decade of research, and too many nuggets of amazing findings for us to share. So I recommend everybody checking out the book and taking a deeper look at this question of how the left met the left in social movements in Ecuador because of the lessons that it has for larger movements beyond Ecuador, and especially around other countries that experience a lot of extraction as part of their, as a primary part of their economy. So much more to talk about, but I guess I'll cut us short. Yeah. And thank you so much, Thea. Thank you to everybody who joined. I'm going to put a link to the book again in the chat. And I'm so sorry if we couldn't get to more of your questions. If you'd like, you can go ahead and email editorial at Jane Family Institute with more questions, and I can send them along. Perhaps it'll come up in a future piece of writing, and sign up for a newsletter, and you'll see it when it comes. So thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for hosting and for facilitating the conversation.
Sure. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.